Hello, my name is Sune Skattegaard Thorsten. I'm from Global CSR consultancy that has specialized in business and human rights since 1998. So thank you very much to the Investor Alliance and Rebecca de Winter-Schmidt to invite us here to explain a little more about some key concepts in the UN Guiding Principles for Business and Human Rights. And one of the key elements of the guiding principles when it comes to business activities, namely human rights due diligence. The concepts that we will concentrate on today are the concepts of causing to adverse impacts, contributing to adverse impacts, or being directly linked to adverse impacts. These are the three possibilities of companies to be in connection with adverse impacts, be involved with adverse impacts. We will also touch upon the concept, the term leverage. What does leverage mean, and where does leverage come into play when you look at corporate responsibility to respect human rights? Let's start from the very start. The guiding principles that came around in 2011 actually put forward for the first time in history the authoritative definitions when it comes to corporate respect for human rights. And it was unanimously endorsed in the UN. Hence, we would all know through Principle 2, that is directed at governments, that at some time in the future, regulation would come around to bring these authoritative definitions, concepts into play in various jurisdictions around the world. And we are working, us that are working out of the EU, Global CSR is from Denmark, are working at a time, in an era where we are seeing that the call from late Professor John Ruggie to have states regulate businesses to respect human rights is now coming into reality. In particular, with the most interesting part, namely the direct obligation to businesses that they should do human rights due diligence. So this year, very soon, actually in May, we are expecting the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive that requires implementation of the UN Guiding Principles and the OECD guidelines when it comes to environmental and economic due diligence, that will come into, that will be passed by the EU during this spring. The UN Guiding Principles have foundational principles and operational principles, and the foundational principles basically outline the theory behind corporate respect for human rights. You need to have a policy commitment, you need to have human rights due diligence in place, and you need to provide access to remedy wherever you have adverse impacts on any of the human rights from the International Bill of Human Rights. This means that all businesses, also no matter what size they are, where they operate, need to establish the management system that was outlined by the UN Guiding Principles in Pillar 2 in order to claim that they respect human rights. The management system consisting of the Human Rights Policy Commitment, the Human Rights Due Diligence process, and access to remedy through effective grievance mechanisms is, so to say, the backbone of that management system. Basically, in Foundational 13, then the three connections or the three involvements with adverse impacts on human rights are first brought forward. So Foundational Principle 13 describes the responsibility to respect human rights through two requirements. The first one is that any company, also investors, should avoid causing or contributing to adverse human rights impacts through own activities and address such impacts when they occur. The second part, and that's very relevant for investors, is that any business, also the investment company, should seek to prevent and mitigate adverse human rights impacts that are directly linked to their operations, products, or services by their business relationships, even if they didn't contribute to those impacts. Actually, this would show you that you have two management streams. One is that you make sure that in your own operations, you run your due diligence. The guidelines, the guiding principles are very clear that all businesses, no matter where they operate or what they do, may have risks of adverse impacts that they need to prevent and mitigate so that they do not become actual impacts or even worse, severe impacts. The whole key to the management system lies in the due diligence part, where all companies should do their due diligence, and as part of being accountable for their due diligence, they need, of course, to track effectiveness of the actions they have in place to prevent and mitigate adverse impacts through indicators, but also, and that's very important, they have to be able to communicate to both impacted stakeholders and their business relationships what they're doing, what they identified, what they're doing to prevent and mitigate, and how they account, how they track effectiveness of this. Hence, the key to the management system is that we have to be transparent vis-a-vis each other as business relationships on how we manage risks of impacts. From the guiding principles, and in order to seek to prevent and mitigate as required by Foundational Principle 13b, the minimum we can expect from any business is, of course, that they demand from all their business relationships also to meet the minimum standard for responsible business conduct, i.e. the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. So we have to share that demand with all our business relationships in order, when they then meet their responsibility to respect human rights, they will also share that demand to the next tier. And hence we will have this cascading effect of the internationally agreed minimum standard for responsible business conduct. But this is not enough vis-a-vis your business relationships. So if you become aware of any impacts, severe impacts, without your full value chain, be it downstream to your suppliers or upstream to your distribution chain, you will have to follow up on such severe impacts. So if you become aware of any actual severe impact, you need to use or build leverage to make that business entity stop the impact and make sure it does not reoccur, i.e. implement the due diligence requirements from the guiding principles. And this is where leverage comes into play. So the last concept that we are dealing with today. So basically, as we can see from the guiding principles, there are three ways that a company can be involved with adverse impacts on human rights. The first one is that you cause the adverse impact. As a business, you do something and it leads directly to an adverse impact on the human rights of your employees, of representatives of the local community, other people that are directly impacted by your actions. An example could be a company that develops artificial intelligence, and by developing the artificial intelligence has used somewhat stereotypically information, and it leads up to it leads to discrimination of people based on skin color by the use of the artificial intelligence. So I'm developing AI, I'm using it in my company, and it leads to adverse impacts on the right not to be discriminated against based on skin color, and that will then be an example of causing an adverse impact. However, it may be that I may develop the AI, but I'm not putting it to market as such. I'm merely selling the software, the solution, the algorithm to another company that brings it to market. However, I was the one that developed the AI, and even though I'm not the one that has the effect on impacted stakeholders, that would be the company that puts it to use. I will now not be causing the adverse impact, but I will be contributing to the adverse impact. I developed the AI, sold it to a business relationship. The business relationship applies it, and now I'm contributing, whereas the company that brings it to market is also contributing. So we are now in a situation where I did something, another company did something, and that led to the adverse impact on human rights. An example of being directly linked can be then used for the same. Now I'm the investor in the company that developed the AI. I didn't ask them to develop artificial intelligence that could lead to discrimination. So I'm not contributing to that decision, but I am now linked to the adverse impact in both situations, actually, because the responsibility of being linked to is established by the mere fact that somewhere in your value chain, there will be an entity that is causing or contributing to the adverse impact. So these are the three ways, and you're responsible for the adverse impact in all three situations. But it's important then to find out how do you act in order to meet your responsibility. And in this case, the guidelines, the guiding principles have described that your business responsibility before something has gone wrong, your responsibility to prevent or mitigate is directly described by the standards. So you should identify the risk, you should do something to prevent and mitigate the adverse impact from occurring, and you should account for what you are doing. And accounting for means that you should track the effectiveness of your actions to prevent and mitigate, and you should be able to communicate at least to the impacted stakeholders, as the stakeholder engagement required by the guiding principles, and to your business relationships, what you identified, what you do to prevent and mitigate, and how you track effectiveness. This is before something has gone wrong, and that responsibility rests on you as a company, also as an investor. You should go through at least the rights mentioned in the International Bill of Human Rights as put forward by the UN Guiding Principles, Principle 12. And you should consider whether you have risks of adverse impacts on the full, on all human rights in relation to any stakeholders that could be impacted, be it own employees or be it people that you otherwise could impact. Doing that impact assessment requires you to both look at situations where you could cause it as a company yourself, but also where you may contribute to the adverse impact. In the case I mentioned, or the example I mentioned, this was through your products the software that you developed, but you were not putting it to market yourself, but another company was, hence you were contributing to that adverse impact. That is before something has actually happened. We should identify these risks and do what we can to avoid them, i.e. prevent or mitigate them. If impacts occur anyway, and they do, all companies will experience that impacts will happen in their company. It could be that you overwork your employees, ask them to work overtime. That's an adverse impact on the right to rest, leisure, and paid holidays. Safe and healthy working conditions is a basic human right that we all have risks of having adverse impacts on. So we should identify these and describe how we prevent and mitigate these adverse impacts on human dignity. But it may go wrong anyway. And does it go wrong? Do we have actual adverse impacts on any of the human rights? We have then to provide access to remedy through effective grievance mechanisms when we cause or contribute to adverse impacts. This is not the case when we are merely linked to adverse impacts. We can participate in providing access to remedy, but it's not part of the responsibility. So when we are contributing to adverse impacts, you will see that two responsibilities flowed from that. One is that we have to identify, prevent, and mitigate and account for the adverse impacts, the part that we are contributing with. But we still have to also consider that there's another business relationship that is also contributing. And before something happens, we have to make sure that they also run their due diligence, where they should also have identified the risks and done what they could do to prevent and mitigate their part of the contribution. But our responsibility before the impact occurs is to share the expectation with the business relationship that they also implement due diligence in own operations and that they put the requirement forward to their business relationships. This is the same responsibility we have when we are merely directly linked to adverse impacts. We have to share at a minimum the expectation with all our business relationships that they meet the standard, that they do their due diligence, where they identify where they may cause or contribute to adverse impacts and do something to prevent and mitigate that these adverse impacts will realize as actual impacts and measure the effectiveness of those initiatives. It may also go wrong where you have contributed to adverse impacts or where you are directly linked to adverse impacts. And this is where the concept of leverage comes into play, because you are asked to use, and if you don't have leverage, to build your leverage to make your business relationship stop the impact. Can also ask them to provide access to remedy, but it's not a direct requirement from the guiding principles. And of course, you would also ask them to prevent or mitigate any reoccurrence of the specific impact or any other impact, i.e. that they implement proper due diligence in own operations. If you do not have leverage and you cannot build leverage, you will be expected to end the relationship, but you have to consider when you are ending a relationship that in itself may lead to adverse impacts that you are now causing. So you have to consider also the adverse impacts that comes from ending a business relationship. These are the three ways you can be connected to an impact as a company. As an investor, investment firm, investment company, pension fund, you will also have to do your own due diligence in own operations. But of course, you may find that the impacts are fairly limited and you are managing most of them already. Nevertheless, you have to be clear and transparent about how you manage those impacts as well. But in most cases, where you're most concerned as an investment firm is your many linkages to potential and actual adverse impacts, because all your investments in business activities create a direct linkage to the impacts that may be caused or contributed to by those entities or projects that you invest in. Hence, you have to make sure that you ask those business entities to do their due diligence and become transparent about how they manage those, so that you can be and feel more safe around your investment. And also you have to be aware that when it goes wrong, you have to use or build your leverage, and often you may have no leverage. You only own a very, very small stock of the company, and then you should try to build that leverage. This is already happening because it's also part of active ownership, as put forward by PRI, Principles for Responsible Investment, that you should engage companies when it goes wrong through active ownership. And most investors have a long tradition for addressing the lack of direct leverage to building their leverage with other investors through intermediaries.